The Great Taking exposes the financial endgame. This is authored by Bert Olivier via the Brownstone Institute. One of the very best exposés of the covert, very well hidden, bellicose attempts to rob all of humanity, barring the minuscule number of psychotic individuals comprising the inimical position of the material possessions and their immaterial freedom, was published very recently. It's accurately titled The Great Taking, 2023, and it was written by David Webb, one of the most courageous and financial savvy authors I've ever come across. He introduces the book on page 1 in uncompromising terms. What is this book about? It's about the taking of collateral, all of it, the end game of this globally synchronous debt accumulation super cycle. This is being executed by long-planned intelligent design, the audacity and scope of which is difficult for the mind to encompass. Included are all financial assets, all money on deposit at banks, all stocks and bonds, and hence all underlying property of all public corporations, including all inventories, plant and equipment, land, material, mineral deposits, inventions, and intellectual property as well. Privately owned personal and real property financed with any amount of debt will be similarly taken, as will the assets of privately owned businesses which have been financed with debt. If even partially successful, this will be the greatest conquest and subjugation in world history. We are now living within a hybrid war conducted almost entirely by deception and thus by designed to achieve aims with very little energy input. It's a war of conquest directed not against other nations, states, but against all of humanity. In the prologue of the book, Webb paints a richly textured autobiographical picture of his provenance as finance guru, obviously with exceptional intelligence, and it turned out courage. His knowledge of finance and economics has been the result of long years of work in the field, but he recalls the assassination of President John F. Kennedy before the start of his professional career, when he was a child, and what he calls witnessing the subsequent industrial collapse of the U.S. in Cleveland, where the family lived, culminating in the complete destruction of everything he had known. Before he gets into the details of his life, he commences the prologue with an indirect imitation of his reasons for writing the book. Presently, as we well know, families are divided. People are experiencing a kind of isolation, perhaps not physically, but in spirit and mind. This has been made to happen through the dark magic of false news and narratives, and this alone has been a great crime against humanity. The tactical purposes are many: to confuse and divide, to cause disengagement, to demoralize, to instill fears, and to introduce false focal points for these fears, to manipulate the historical narrative, to create a false sense of the present reality, and ultimately to cause people to acquiesce to what has been planned. It's impossible to overstate the urgency of Webb's message. Everyone who reads this article should download the book free in the link provided above, or at least view the documentary based on it on CHGTV, Rumble, and I don't know for how long, YouTube. It makes for a compulsive reading, a kind of non-fictional, real-world detective story, whether you, the reader, are both the victim of the crime and the one looking over the detective's shoulder at the evidence that he is digging up. And is there persuasive evidence in the court of human justice which should be established if it does not exist? The primary documentary evidence adduced by Webb would be sufficient to incarcerate all of these culprits, if not condemn them to capital punishment, recalling that etymologically capital, or of the head in Latin, relates to one's head, which was usually implicated in hanging and decapitation, also echoing the wearing of the cap. That Webb knows only too well how he has exposed himself and his family with his book, and earlier in addresses where he shared his findings with audiences in Sweden and the US, is clear where he writes against the backdrop of 2 occasions where he presented his insights together with the evidence. Less than a month after speaking at that conference in the US, a man contacted me who asked me in Stockholm. He had been the chairman of a US political party, and had a long career related to the defense establishment. He stayed at the hotel within a short walking distance from my apartment. We had lunch. He suggested a pint of ale. He asked me to explain the subject of which I had spoken at the conference. I went through the evidence and implications. The odd thing is that he then asked no questions about the subject. Instead, he fixed me in the eyes and said, "Does your family know you're doing this?" He said nothing more, and that was the end of the meeting. I paid the bill and left. Perhaps it had been a courtesy call. We all have to die sometime, and being assassinated must be among the most honorable ways to do it. One must have been doing something right, made a difference. No classier way to die, really. I always wanted to be like John Lennon. And one could easily be fooled by Webb's debonair shrugging off of what could indeed have been a thinly veiled death threat from his dinner guest. But the fact remains that anyone who has the courage to oppose the psychopaths trying to hijack the world runs a tremendous risk, the more high profile such opposition becomes. This is shown in the recent death by suicide of Janet Osebard, who made the series The Fall of the Cabal and was involved in the unmasking of a network of pedophiles. The chances that she committed suicide are pretty slim, and I would say she was evidently a thorn in the side of the cabal. Now, returning to Webb's book, he tellingly recounts how after 9/11 he saw the signs of deteriorating U.S. economy everywhere. Concomitantly, there were undeniable indications that the Bush administration was spreading disinformation on this, covering it up by disseminating spurious reports of American economic strength. In reality, however, the opposition was the case, symptomatic of which was the rapid shutting down of American manufacturing capacity and outsourcing it to China and other countries, which was obviously in on the deal. Nothing less than the planning loss of American industrial base was occurring, while accompanying this, Alan Greenspan was lauding the putative productivity miracle resulting from technology investment and development. It was a masterly performance of pulling the wool over Americans' eyes. And simultaneously, the impression of prosperity was further solidified by projecting the illusion that there was no risk in borrowing money. The ability to repay loans was ostensibly guaranteed. Webb's persistent perspicuous sleuthing has uncovered the trail which reveals the steps taken years ago to prepare for the global economic collapse we're now facing. This included the 2008 financial collapse, of which he writes wryly, "In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, it eventually became known that tens of trillions in losses in derivative positions were housed in the biggest banks, which were then bailed out with newly created money. The prime brokers would have failed, but to prevent that, they were made banks and also received direct injections of created money from the Fed. No one was prosecuted. On the contrary, the perpetrators were rewarded with enormous bonuses. It was almost as if it had gone according to plan." If I understand Webb correctly, this is a strategy that has been repeated several times, at least since the second half of the 19th century, resulting in the rich getting much richer and the poor getting much poorer. In brief, focusing on velocity of money, VOM, velocity multiplied by money supply equals GDP. Lower velocities result in lower GDP. And Webb shows that given the cyclic collapse of economies and empires in the 20th century, following the Great War and the demonstrable benefit, despite all this hardship, of certain banking interests regarding control and creation of money, as well as of key institutions, the contemporary heirs of all this control knew that a similar collapse would recur, and they have been preparing for it, and they are determined to remain in control, hence the great support, the supposed Great Reset. During the dot-com bubble and bust period, Webb studied the relationship between financial markets and the Federal Reserve Bank and realized that the latter was deliberately influencing the former by manipulating the money supply, that is, routinely printing more money than correctively GDP growth. If money supply growth is more than GDP growth, a financial bubble develops, divorced from any real economic growth. And by the end of 1999, the money supply had increased by more than 40% of GDP annually, signaling that VOM was imploding. Does this sound familiar? Since the start of the pandemic, trillions of US dollars have been printed, accelerating the widening of gap between money supply and real economic productivity, and thus hastening the financial collapse. This is what the cabal wants, and after all, as Webb tersely remarks, crises do not occur by accident. They are induced intentionally and used to consolidate power and to put in place measures which will be used later. Rather apocalyptically, he continues. And just how far becomes increasingly clear as one reads through the densely documented book, not a book with many pages, but a big book as far as the importance of its theme and its substantiation is concerned. Given the number of reports and other sources which Webb cites, it's impossible to do justice here to all their details and their penitence for Webb's argument that the so-called elites have spent years to prepare for a supercycle collapse that will necessitate the transition to the New World Order, with them still in control. I can therefore only lift out the salient parts of his argument, neatly captured where he writes on page 7, there are now no property rights to securities held in book entry form in any jurisdiction globally. In the grand scheme, to confiscate all collateral, dematerialization of securities was the essential first step. The planning and efforts began over half a century ago. Not only was the CIA intimately involved in this dematerialization, which essentially meant moving from paper-based stock certificate archive to computer-based system, but the CIA project leader was moved to a senior position in the banking sector without any banking experience. Webb raises the possibility, interrogatively, that the ensuing paperwork crisis was manufactured to justify the dematerialization process, which paved the way for the present electronic archiving system worldwide. Small wonder the epigraph for this chapter is a quote from Sun Tzu from The Art of War, which is just as applicable to all today. All warfare is based on deception. This also covers the topic of the next chapter, security entitlement, of which Webb writes, the greatest subjugation in world history will have been made possible by the invention of a construct, a subterfuge, a lie, the security entitlement. And indeed, having informed one that since their inception more than 400 years ago, these tradable financial instruments were recognized by law as personal property, he hits the reader with the news that this is not the case any longer. In practice, Webb says this implies that even if wishing to avoid the complications of a car dealership possibly going bust after purchasing a car on an installment plan, one has bought it for cash, this will no longer work. Security entitlements have been changed legally to permit creditors of the bankrupt car dealership to seize your car as an asset that still belongs to the dealership. And Webb sums up the legal coup as follows on page 10. Essentially, all securities owned by the public in custodial accounts, pension plans, and investment funds are now encumbered as collateral underpinning the derivatives complex. The protected class have legally stolen all our assets from us, and even before the anticipated and engineered global financial implosion occurs, if it does. And moreover, through additional legislation, this has been harmonized to ensure that secured creditors be guaranteed that their assets be protected through cross-border mobility of legal control of such collateral. And furthermore, safe harbor provisions were made timeously to protect the ruling class. But it gets worse. It turns out that if something called central clearing parties tasked with providing clearing and settlement for trades in a variety of financial transactions is insufficiently capitalized to prepare for the eventuality of failing, and such a failure occurs, it's the secured creditors who will take the assets of the entitled holders. This is where it's going. It's designed to happen suddenly and on a vast scale, Webb says. and Webb goes on to disabuse readers of the belief that the so-called bank holiday ended the Great Depression, and of believing Ben Bernanke promised in 2002 that the Federal Reserve won't do it again, hence makes its mistakes regarding what led to the Great Depression, and instead he cautions, is the Fed indeed very sorry? Can one believe the promise that we won't do it again? They have studied the lessons of the past in detail. However, their purpose has been to prepare a new and improved global version of the spectacular end of this debt expansion supercycle, and that's what this book is about. Webb's elaboration of the Great Deflation is a salutary reminder that this kind of thing has happened before in the 1930s, albeit not on the scale that is being planned this time. And in the conclusion, he drives his point home by confronting readers with the stark reality of what's happening. I feel like quoting the whole of this powerful chapter, but obviously that is redundant because the book can and should be downloaded free via the link provided near the beginning of the article. Please read it. It's imperative to read all the detail that cannot be supplied here. Here's a citation from it. As a human being, should this not concern you? What part of the organized slaughter of vast numbers of innocent people can you find acceptable? Do you believe that you are special in some way, that you were being protected, or that you will be protected now? There's been abundant evidence of great evil at work in the world throughout time, and in our present time. Do you really wish to be ignorant of its existence and operation? To not know is bad. To not want to know is worse. Willful ignorance of the existence and operation of evil is a luxury even the wealthy can no longer afford. We have witnessed designs and real attempts to exert physical control over every person's body globally, and this is continuing. And why is this happening? Never before has a system benefited so few to the great expense of so many. Is this not inherently unstable and unsustainable? Physical control, as opposed to rule by deception, requires enormous energy. Can this be sustained while destroying all economies and abusing all people globally? They do not know how to build back better. Look at their footprint around the world, the destruction, the economic devastation. And let me close with John F. Kennedy's own words. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. And in turn, I conclude with the last paragraph of Webb's prologue. Let's take this to heart. This is my hope, that in making this unpleasantness explicit, and doing so at this time when developments are becoming more apparent, that awareness might spread and that the worst might be averted. Perhaps this great taking might not be allowed to happen if we each hold up our end, even the investment bankers, and say forcefully, we will not allow this. It is a construct. It is not real. Amen, he says. And this is by Bert Olivier via the Brownstown Institute on Zero Hedge by Tyler Durden. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.